Okay, I want to welcome you to today's conversation. I have a special guest with us today who is multifaceted in many different ways that I'm going to describe here in just a moment. But today we're going to be talking about overcoming heartache through the example of Job. Job is one of those books that when you look through it, you can relate, but it's also a very scary book because you realize that the human experience in some ways encompasses incredible delight, but incredible loss. And how do we work through grief? How do we work through loss? How do we work through the deepest pain that a human being can experience? And this is an interview that I am looking forward to being edified by, number one. But number two, my hope is that in listening to this, some of you who have incredible loss and grief in your life can connect and even share this with someone who's going through a difficult situation in their life. Darryl Potter has been a nurse, carpenter, cook, chicken catcher, emergency room assistant, medical genetics lab technician, investment broker, IT manager, and banking products manager. He has explored Egypt's pyramids, Israel's deserts, and Turkey's archaeology, and turned many of those experiences into a series of historical fiction novels published by Paperstone Press. In addition to studying Alexandrian Greek and ancient Hebrew poetry, he has been bitten by a wolf in northern British Columbia, attacked by a western diamondback rattlesnake in California, and struck by lightning on Canada's west coast. I don't know if I'm interviewing some man or the Apostle Paul. We'll see. When Darryl is not exploring the local woods and trails, he and his wife share their home outside Toronto, Ontario, with their two children and growing collection of bonsai trees. All these professional, practical, personal, and publishing experiences are overshadowed by the reality of his family's caring over 20 years for their medically fragile oldest child. 40 years of spiritual seeking, 40 years of writing, 40 years of working in a wide variety of industries, and over 20 years of plumbing the heights and depths of medical triumph and trauma come together in his first nonfiction book, Even the Monsters, Living with Grief, Loss, and Depression. Darryl, welcome to the channel, my brother.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Well, I've got a book that you wrote, and I just want to say for our audience, this is, talk about Even the Monsters. This book, in some ways, is monstrous. It is a thick, robust entry in terms of Job's experience and your experiences and what scripture says and so forth. So for those of you watching right now, I would highly recommend. I started thumbing through this book, but we're going to be talking through some of the things that he points out in this book in terms of Job's journey today. And so if you would like more information on it, you can go to his website, which I'll put in the description. It's www.darrylpotter.com. But I want to first ask you the simple question: why did you decide to write this book? And then also, why did you decide to choose Job as a character to follow?
Yeah, great question. In the last year, there's a Kate Bush song that shot back to popularity.
Yes.
The line in the song, if I only could, I'd make a deal with God. I started this study in Job because I thought I did already have a deal with God. I was living in Vancouver, which is on Canada's west coast, beautiful city, one of the most beautiful in the world, beautiful wife, great church I was part of. I was working in a bank, my wife working in a law firm, double income, no kids. Everything was super awesome. Vacations in Hawaii and Mexico and wherever else. And then our daughter came along, and my deal with God was wrecked, or was rather exposed to not having existed at all. I thought if I lived a certain kind of Christian life, went to church regularly, tithed, did all the right stuff, then God had my back, and we were good. Pretty shallow view of how Christianity works, but I don't think it's that rare. And when my daughter was born, my life was wrecked. And that might sound a bit dramatic, but you can read Even the Monsters and get where I'm coming from. 10 days in, we knew we had problems, and my wife's health went out the window, and then career stuff started becoming an issue. And, when week 2 turned into week 3, it was just getting worse. And when month 2 turned into month 3, it got worse. And it just kept getting worse. The second decade was worse than the first decade. Like it was like, wow, spread the pain out a little. Like, what's the deal with it just stacking up here on our family? Um, first thing I did was I went to Job because I knew it was a book in the Bible on suffering that I hadn't really explored a lot. But I figured, okay, now I'm suffering. Book in the Bible on suffering ought to be able to help. Uh, in full candor, it was completely useless. And so I thought, okay, I just didn't do a good job. So I slowed down and read it slower. And after that second read, I came away with, wow, this is really useless. And it really called into question my faith, because I thought, if the creator of the universe writes a book on suffering that is completely useless when somebody's actually suffering, then he's either not very good at it, or he doesn't exist. And I put my Christianity on, I don't think this is necessarily the best way of going about personal Bible study, but I put my Christianity on trial on the book of Job. Kind of in the spirit of Jacob wrestling the angel. I wasn't letting go till I got a blessing or I stopped being a Christian. And I spent 10 years, sometimes only an hour a day, sometimes 2 or 3 a day, which for 10 years, except study Job. And when I was done with one commentary, I just got another one, and the commentaries got heavier and deeper, and to the point where I was studying translators' handbooks, trying to pick this book apart, because if it can't help somebody suffering, I don't know about all the other books in the Bible either. And when I was done, it turned into a sermon series at a church I was at. By then I was in Ontario, Toronto area, and then eventually the book. So that's why Job, and why writing it was kind of an afterthought. It was a decade before that did all the work to lay the groundwork.
One of the things I think is important, first of all, just how honest you've been. I think there's a lot of folks, including me at times, I can relate to what you just shared. And it's interesting, at the end of Job, and we'll get there, I don't want to ruin anything, but the end of Job, God kind of has this conviction that he wants to instill, I think, in the audience, which is, whatever you go through it with me, and you're going to be completely honest. God wants, you can take a punch. And so I want to kind of get into the second question, which is, you took some punches. Okay. You had grief and disorienting loss. When we lose certain things, like our car keys or something, that's one form of loss or whatever. Or maybe we lose a debit card and we got to call the bank and reorder it. But then there's things that you can't replace. That's almost like when you find out what loss really feels like. Like, you'll never get this back. You'll never get this person or this experience back, or your health back, or whatever. And it's disorienting. And one of your chapters, you mention contradictory emotions. On one hand, we have this part of us that feels this way, and another. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. So I think I had the idea earlier on in my faith that, and I don't think you need to be a Christian to think this way, that we can only really feel one thing at a time if we're rational, if we're properly estimating a situation. And I think Paul puts it, Paul says something in 1 Thessalonians 5 that I think was part of what messed me up, and it may mess other people up, where he talks about we need to give thanks in all circumstances because that's God's will for you in life, which can make a very plastic Christian. When you're supposed to give thanks in all circumstances, and if you don't recognize that the verse doesn't say that's the only thing that you're supposed to feel in all circumstances, you can wind up lying to yourself and those around you with some sort of artificial, happy, everything's fine Christianity, when it's like, no, this sucks. This is bad. This is not good. Jesus himself, in Hebrews, it says he was heard because of his loud cries and tears. God in human form had loud cries and tears and was heard because of it. So apparently he was violating Paul's, command, but no, he was allowed to have loud cries and tears and and still have all the other things. I use the example in the book of a dentist. I can be super happy about being in a a 21st century, modern society with a healthcare plan where I can get my teeth fixed,
Hmm.
and be super unhappy about going to the dentist. You're allowed to feel more than one thing at a time. Jesus wept at Lazarus's tomb, and part of me thinks, dude, stop the weeping and just raise him already. Like the 5 minutes you spent weeping, you could have had the guy out of the ground already. Um, but I learned, I think through my daughter, that one of the things I say in the book is that if I could go back to myself 20 years ago, I'd say, boy, you better learn how to cry, because nobody can bottle this forever. You better learn how to cry. And Jesus cried, Paul cried, Jeremiah got into some nasty fights with God in terms of his unhappiness with God's plans for his life, but he still was God's man. So that's where I was coming from with that contradictory emotions business. It's a level of maturity that I did not have as a young married guy or a young Christian.
I'm actually very glad that you just brought that up, because I think that in a weird way, that to people who aren't in the faith, I'm sure they look at Christians. I like that idea of plastic Christians. They look at us, and I think at times they see us do things that don't look very human. Like, let's spiritualize something that Jesus doesn't even spiritualize away. So, for example, you're mentioning Lazarus. We see in Hebrews, loud cries, petitions, one who could save him from death. On and on and on. The human experience is the full spectrum. And yet as a Christian, I think there's this, and I found this treating trauma with Christians, I think there's this sort of reluctance. It's like, if I acknowledge trauma, then I'm somehow minimizing the cross. I'm saying that Jesus's blood didn't take away whatever it was that it was supposed to take away. And I feel like I'm betraying God if I admit that it hurts, or I succumb to acknowledging, well, this is not easy. And so we can spiritualize certain feelings and emotions away in the name of Christ.
Yeah.
And when we look at his testimony, he doesn't do that. And I don't know where that's coming from. Maybe sometimes we use Christianity, we use spirituality as a smokescreen because we don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to process. And I've been there, by the way. This isn't just but let me ask you, what kinds of grief or losses do you write about in the book that you've experienced personally?
So I focused in the book on family circumstances around my daughter's birth. So she's got a combination of diagnoses that we didn't get till she was 8 years old. We now know retroactively she wasn't supposed to live past age 3. 90% of the kids who have what she has are dead by age 3. 99.9% don't make it through the teen years. It's degenerative, it's terminal, it's usually fast. She's 22 now, but she's in a wheelchair now. She used to walk with a walker. She can't talk. 12 years old was the last time she spoke a word. It's degenerative, and it takes her a little bit at a time. So there's been that. My wife, 3 months after my daughter was born, and everything kind of went down the tubes with our first child. My wife wound up in hospital. They thought it was a stroke, a series of strokes, and they thought it was a brain aneurysm. She was blacking out. She was unconscious. She wasn't able to communicate. She's coming back around and then disappearing again. This has gone on for over 20 years now, and we still don't have a good diagnosis. I wound up with cancer along the way. Job stresses. Moving across the country was bad news. Moving from the West Coast, it's a similar culturally for American listeners, moving from California to New York. So it was a culture shock. I grew up in California, but moving from Vancouver to Toronto, culture shock. Friends disappeared. Our church family obviously went through a huge upheaval during that period. There's just a lot that was going on, and it was relentless. So I speak to the losses, not so much in the classic, somebody died and I've got trying to get closure. I remember at times thinking it would be easier if somebody died. I've got somebody
Mm.
dying. I've had friends who've had a relative pass from cancer, and it's 2 years of agony um, while they're in palliative care. We've had 22 years of palliative care, and every day is just a little bit worse, and it's relentless. One of the funny things about COVID was my wife and I talked to each other about the fact that, hey, the rest of the world is now living like us because we've
Hmm.
been under a kind of marital house arrest for 22 years.
Oh my
One of
goodness.
us has to be with her all the time, and
Mm.
to go out for dinner together is roughly $400 in nursing bills, uh, just to pop into the local diner. My son is in university now. He's never once had a family vacation because I'll take him places. My wife can take him places. We can't go anywhere because we're in a permanent palliative care end of life situation that just stands at the door and doesn't cross over. We literally save her life 3 or 4 times a week. And
Mm.
I mean, full on medical, high drama. She's back, you know, uh, 3 or 4 times a week. Um, and that could be 3 in the morning. That can be, so there's sleep deprivation in there. There's all sorts of other things that just compound the story. So that's some of the specifics for why I tackled Job and so on.
Mm. As you were talking, I was thinking about how Job went through very similar, and I wouldn't say similar in terms of the specifics, but similar in terms of one thing after another,
Mm,
another punch, another hit, another kick, all while you're down, trying to get up.
mm,
And then something happens. He enters dialogue with his friends, and that actually doesn't go as planned.
mm.
It started good,
Yeah.
and then we got off track. But before we get to that, I want to just give you a moment to talk about how the way you structure this book, taking someone through
Uh,
a process of discovery, because this book is if and I look for a table of contents, I don't actually see one. Um, it's a commentary in some
mhm,
ways. And
mhm.
so, but the chapters are so written. It's a big book, but the chapters are pretty short, actually. I would just say that to those listening right now. This is a great companion to go through the book of Job. Um, but what are some things about this sort of companion that will be helpful as people process the things that you're talking about?
Yeah. So what I came away with was, first of all, the material on Job seems to fall into two camps, and I probably haven't read everything out there, so I don't want to disparage any excellent book that might be out there. But I seem to notice that they fell into two camps. They were either very thin. I don't mean size wise. I mean in terms of depth. Chicken soup for the soul. For Job, kind of
Mm,
uh, relatively shallow. Feel good or feel bad or whatever, but or they were non-readable for a non-academic, um,
mm,
and there didn't seem to be anything in the middle. And Job is potentially the oldest book in the Bible in terms of not its when it's the setting, but in terms of the actual writing of it. If not, it's certainly one of the oldest. And it's very unrelatable to us. Plus, we don't read epic poetry. We don't read ancient Hebrew poetry. It operates on different principles. So what I've done is when I was done my 10 years of deep study, I thought, okay, if I'm going to turn this around, I need to make it accessible, but not shallow.
mm,
I need to give that academic rigor. There's some commentaries, for example, I picked up. I was like, man, this thing makes no sense whatsoever. And then 8 years later, and however many dozen commentaries later, uh, I picked it up again and I could get it, because you essentially have to be 8 miles deep before you can even read what the guy's written. There's too many assumptions baked into the writing. So what I've done is I've woven my personal story and the commentary together so that you're following along with my journey as I discovered Job. And I wanted to weave the personal narrative and the commentary together, how I'm uncovering things, times where I'm mad at God and Job's mad at God, places where I don't have answers yet, but I'm just moving to the next chapter in order for the reader to relate. Because there's things that occur. For example, Job shaves his head and tears his clothes, which doesn't resonate to us today. But those are two very distinct acts that together paint the deepest level of a grief and physical expression of grief in that culture. And they mean very different things. But we don't relate. It's like, dude got himself a haircut and wrecked his clothing. How's that relate to anything? And so trying to bring it into both my own personal expressions of grief as well as make it relatable to a reader. So they work together. And I think it brings the emotion in. Because Job is written in poetry, which by design means you should be reacting emotionally. But 3,000-year-old ancient Hebrew poetry operating on completely different principles is probably not resonating with most people outside of the facts. And you're supposed to feel it, not think it. It's poetry. And so a lot of what I do is taking, okay, this is the trick the Hebrew poetry has done, but here's the modern equivalent, whether it's a anecdote or it's a reference to Elizabethan poetry or something. I had a lot of that stuff in there. My editor took it out. But the point is, I want it to be relatable, but deep.
I want to, before we get to the friends piece, I mean, you're saying so many things that are so good and nourishing. I actually, as a mental health professional, I've dealt with a lot of folks who have gotten into cutting. And it's interesting, in the book of Job, you see these different aspects. I think there's even a point, I don't remember exactly where Job picks up a piece of pottery and I think cuts himself or something. Let me just go into cutting for a moment, because I've never covered this in a conversation. Cutting is, for a lot of people, they don't realize that it's about taking something that is emotional and creating a physical sort of thing with it, and then managing it that way. And the other aspect of cutting that most people don't realize is that it doesn't just release something. There are certain chemicals that are released when we cut. The reason why I think this matters is because I think that, to your point, when we look at things that have been around for a long time, if it's been around a long time, we feel like we can't relate, or we feel like our problems are the newest, that cutting wasn't around in the past or something, or people didn't do self-injury. No, self-harm has been around a long time. And it's ironic that you find different aspects of, lament that look out of control in the book of Job.
Yeah.
He has a way of physically demonstrating. I mean, you see it in Jeremiah, and Ezekiel some too, but this is an embodied experience. And so it's, you can take someone who's a teenager who's struggling with cutting, and they can go to the book of Job.
Yeah.
And find relatability. And so, just as you were talking about that, I thought to myself, wow, there are listeners right now who have cut before.
Yeah.
And you know why you've cut. Job can relate. And so this isn't something we talk a lot about in Christianity, because we pretend that these things don't exist and it's not good for the optics. But this is the human experience, So anyway, I wanted to just say something about that very, very briefly.
Yeah, I love that.
Okay, so you write about friendships in the book. This is where I find that the trauma that people experience can get amplified. So if I'm going through a really hard situation, and depending on who's in my inner circle, it could make it worse.
Yeah.
And even if I get through it, I'll look back at how I was treated when I was going through that time by those people, whoever it was. And so how we are treated and who we surround ourselves with when we're going through hard times matters.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you write about friendships. What are some, so a couple things. What are some important factors in looking for friendships when we're suffering? Okay. And what are some important things to remember in being a friend to someone who is suffering?
So I'd say Job says something really interesting early on in the book, chapter 6, I believe, of Job, where he says, he who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty.
Whoa.
Yeah. Like, that is how he starts a whole section on friendship. And he describes his friends as being like the experience of a traveler in the desert seeking out an oasis and discovering that it's dried up. Like that, he tells his friends, I need you to be present with me. And they weren't. They were doing something that I've discovered is actually incredibly common, both in my own personal life as well as in observations of what I see around me, and then reading some of the psychological literature. That so often what people will tend to do when faced with someone they know going through trial or trauma is find things to say to make themselves feel better.
Mm.
That might fall into the category of blaming the victim. So if I can somehow say you caused this to yourself, I'm going to feel better about how the world works. If I can just, and it's so, I'll even hear it just in casual around the office at, secular workplace chit chat. It's not a Christian thing. Somebody just had something, and immediately there becomes a subtext of what did they do to deserve that? And in some cases, people do things to deserve trouble in their life. You drink, you get in a car accident. Wow, cause and effect. But that's not the role God calls us to as Christians. If judgment needs to occur, that's God's job. Our job is to love. Our job is to be friends. Our job is to come alongside. Our job is to comfort. One of the things to look for in a friend is who in your life is brave when you're in trouble.
Wow.
Who runs to you and who runs away from you. That's a big litmus test for the quality of your friends. In terms of how to be a friend, you just almost say everything I just said in reverse. Seeking out those who you have chosen to invest in. We can't be friends with a million people, so you do have to invest. But who am I investing my friendship in? And am I going to them when they're in trouble, or am I waiting till they get over it so we can go back to watching sports again, or whatever our the ground of our acquaintanceship is? Are we speaking words to comfort, encourage, and heal, or are we speaking words to make ourselves feel better? I really think you probably can, there's lots of stories about so-and-so helped me, straighten me out, iron sharpens iron. Like there's lots of principles where friends can say strong words to each other. But I think you're probably, if you erred on the side of just leave the instruction and the teaching to professional counselors and God, you probably get through life pretty good. As a matter of fact, I think even professional counselors and God tend to do a lot more listening than they do talking. Whereas my experience of friends is once they start talking, and not all friends, but they tend to act like they are God and a professional counselor together. And that's where Job's friends went way wrong. And they nearly ruined Job's spiritual life. They got him sideways with God when he wasn't to begin with. And he had to actually talk them out of their influence. Sorry, he had to talk himself out of their influence on him, which he does about halfway through his speeches, before he got back on stable ground again. And at the end of the book, of course, God beats the tar out of the three friends. There's four friends, by the way. Three were knuckleheads. The fourth was awesome. Something most people miss in the book of Job because
I'd missed it.
Friend number one and friend number four have similar names, Eliphaz and Elihu. And so I think people just run them together by the time you get to 3/4 of the way through the book when Elihu shows up. But Elihu's the one that God doesn't have a problem with. Job doesn't have a problem with, and he's brilliant. He's the only one who comes alongside Job. He's the only one who says, I'm your friend. I'm a man just like you, and I got problems too. He's the only one who says, I have no idea what God's doing in your life. Sometimes God corrects through punishment. Sometimes he prevents trouble. Sometimes he's doing things for reasons you have no idea. But let me tell you what I do know. God is complicated. God doesn't always explain himself, but he's good. And whatever he's doing is looking after you, even if he doesn't tell you what it is. Elihu is fantastic. The problem is by the time people get to Elihu, I think they've kind of glazed over and they're not really listening anymore. And they think it's the same name as Eliphaz because it's an
Right.
E name that I don't recognize.
Oh, this is phenomenal. Let me just sort of reflect on a couple of things you just said. One of the big things you just said that I think as a Christian, you can take when Paul says you're competent to counsel, right? That
Hmm.
nutheteu, I think it is the verb of where we get nuthetic counseling.
Yeah.
And so I don't think I'm saying the Greek word right. But anyway, it's this idea of you're competent to counsel. You have God's spirit. And so you can admonish, you can correct, you can encourage, you can do all these different things. However, this is, I think, the caveat with that is I think often when we try to admonish someone else, we are not connecting with what's going on in our bodies. So in other words, our bodies are kind of the shared real estate between us and our experiences. And here's what I've noticed as a marriage and family therapist. If I don't have room in my body, I will not have space for their story. So in other words, I have to have space in my body in order to make room for their story. And so when my body is really full, I do more talking, right? It makes sense. I'm full. I need to get it out. And another person needs me to be in a posture where I can be a place where they can pour. And so it feels like to some degree, again, going back to spiritualizing things, we major in sort of the well, I need to have the right answer and I need to give this person what they need so they cannot feel that anymore. What I hear you saying, and I totally agree, it's us, our feelings that we're trying to manage. Oftentimes when we are trying to give someone advice, when we are trying to give someone what they need so they can become more rational or whatever it is, because it would make us feel better. And the question then becomes, is at what point do we have blind spots in these ways in terms of being a friend? I even ask my friends sometimes. I'll ask them, even though I'm a therapist, I'm like, hey, I want to know, do you think I listen to you? Do you feel like I give you space? And I want you to be honest with me. I want you to tell me the truth. I usually get pretty good feedback, but sometimes when I ask my wife that question, I don't get I get a different answer. Right?
Yeah.
So what I hear you saying, and this is my next question, and I think you kind of answered it, but I want to dig a little further. How can we learn from the mistakes of Job's friends? You say at the end of Job, the Lord himself comes down hard on Job's friends, like hard.
Yeah.
And when you go through, this is the crazy thing I need your help with. When you go through and you look at his friends and what they're saying, they say true things.
Yeah, they do.
That's what's hard. Is they're saying things that are true, but there's something sort of underneath it that's accusational almost, right? So my question is how do you deal with Job's friends when they're speaking with truth?
So here's what I'd say. And this is where you've really got to go deep with Job is often Job's friends get referred to exactly that way as Job's friends, as though they are a monolith. And they're not. They're remarkably different, but you've got to pay attention. So Eliphaz is I was a lot like Eliphaz, frankly. I needed to learn the Eliphaz personality type. He's very religious, very traditional, very like it's this way. And if all facts are contrary to this, at the end, actually, in his third speech, he doesn't say true things. He actually, in his third speech, he's just throwing out wild accusations because he's in full freak out the fact that his worldview is being dismantled, and he cannot deal with it. So he's like that, the worst of the fundamentalist Christian that winds up realizing he's so wrong and can't humble out, and so just melts down. That was kind of me. Bildad has got a different personality. Bildad is mouthy. Bildad takes his cues from other people. Eliphaz was a thinker. Wrong, but he was a thinker. Bildad was not a thinker. Bildad was, I don't know, I don't want to be negative. I grew up in the country, so I'm a little sensitive when people refer to people as rednecks as though that automatically only means one thing. But he's a little bit that kind of stereotype of a mouthy. You picture him, drinking too many beers and just like expounding on nonsense and picking up cues from random sources. He's he's the one who says the harshest things.
Mm.
He's very sharp and impatient, and super big on his level of authority. Um, Zophar, I didn't do this in the book. I refer to him as Zophar the Witless. Zophar is a guy who's not paying attention. If I was to write the book again today, I would probably refer to him as like a social media, glued to his phone, only half paying attention to the conversation. I didn't quite use that analogy in the book, and I used some other ones. But he's the guy who's not paying attention. He says a lot of things. Job, when you said blah, 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 and then if you carefully look for where Job said that, no, Eliphaz said that. Or you just quoted Bildad. And he's getting mad at Job for something somebody else said. Like he was not tracking. He was like drifting in and out. And he's the guy who doesn't have a third speech. It's like he forgot to talk. He was just so busy on his phone, he didn't realize it was my cue. He didn't even rejoin. So there's some personality types there that I think people will resonate with. But in order to learn from them, you've got to differentiate them. And they've got to stop being Job's friends, and they've got to become Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, completely different personalities. And then you get to Elihu and you realize, okay, here's somebody who actually had something decent to say.
Let's go back to the first week of Job's suffering.
Yeah.
What did they do right?
They sat on the ground for 7 days and shut their trap. They did not talk. I think that's brilliant, because I imagine they ate food. I imagine they got up to use the washroom, and I can just, as a fiction writer, I wanted to actually expand on that a bit in the book. I didn't get creative because I wanted to keep it, commentary-like in some respects, but I can just picture them getting up, going off to do their business, coming back, sitting down. I can imagine them, somebody snored in the night. Like they were physically present for him. I imagine somebody brought them food, patriarchal society, 3,000, 4,000, whatever years ago. They would have handed food back and forth to each other. They would have passed a water skin back and forth. They would have looked at each other. They were physically there for him and didn't try to play amateur armchair psychologist, or theologian for that matter.
Yeah, and I think for some people that's going to be a challenge for exactly the reason you mentioned at the beginning, which I think was a very humble statement, which is, and you would use fundamentalists, and I think that some people will hear fundamentalists as, well, but we keep it simple, and we keep it about obedience, and we keep it about, the things that denominations don't do well, we do well. We don't get caught up in theology and all of that, and just sort of grit your use some grit, whatever it is, and just get through it. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that gets imported into the way we provide discipling in our relationships. And it's interesting because I think in our minds, we actually don't, like, if we were to record ourselves talking to people, like when I was going into becoming a therapist, we had to record our sessions. And it's interesting what you think you are when you're counseling someone, how you think you're giving advice or whatever. And then you see it on the tape, and then your supervisor's like, whoa, or look at your body, or look at your tone, or you don't even see that when you did that, your client did this. Like, and so these are the little things that you're talking about as a therapist, and the professionals and so forth that, man, I remember getting all kinds of training. And the biggest thing that I would say when it comes to, I don't want people to be scared to get in people's lives, but it's just the posture of curiosity. Are you curious?
Oh, I love that. Curious. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, curiosity is
Not
the
judgment.
cure. I think the curiosity is a cure for criticism. And so you were mentioning earlier how, maybe some of us come from groups that, have everything on straight, and those groups are not potentially very curious. It sounds like at the end of Job, the Lord sort of put the hammer down on everybody who wasn't curious.
Yeah.
except for the guy who was
Mm.
Elihu,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It
Exactly.
seems like he was curious, right?
Hmm. Yeah. He had no preconceived notions that he knew what God was doing. Um, he just knew what God's character was.
Hmm.
And I'm your friend.
Wow. Wow. So at the end of the book, you talk about wanting to understand. There's
Hmm.
specifically a chapter that you talk about. And Job never got an answer.
No, he didn't.
How do we live without answers, Darryl?
I got two answers to that. How do you live without answers? But before I mention either of them, I'll say I think there's different patterns in Scripture. So Job never got an answer. Jeremiah is another one who never got an answer. Like his life was so meaningful, but by any stretch of the imagination, it was a failure through his entire life. Nobody ever listened to him. They all went into captivity. And then he told them at the end of his life, whatever you do, don't go to Egypt to escape all this trouble. And then he gets kidnapped and taken to Egypt and dies there. Like nothing
Wow.
worked. But his life was so amazing in terms of turning the nation of Israel around 70 years after he was dead. So he didn't get an insight. Other times you get, the story of Paul, where he's like, God tells him ahead of time, here's what you're going to suffer, and here's what heaven looks like. Most of us would like to be like Paul. We'd like to know what's going to happen and how it's all going to work out. Not very many of us get Paul's deal. I think we'd settle for Joseph. So Joseph had no idea what's going on for decades, but at the end of his life, he's like, okay, I see how it all stitches together.
Yeah.
So, there's some of us who would settle for that, but I think most of us are more like Job or even Jeremiah. Job, at least things went positive at the end. Jeremiah, they never did turn out positive. The early Christians who got martyred, it's like, okay, that didn't work out very well. And I think most of us are in that category. So how do you live with that? I've got two answers. First of all, you don't have a choice. I use the analogy in the book is that life's like being dropped in the ocean sometimes, and you're drowning, and it's cold, and the sharks might be coming, and God is like a life buoy, and we want the helicopter, and
Right.
God has supplied us himself as a life buoy for whatever reason. Going back to Elihu's thing, he's complicated. He doesn't explain himself, but he's got a good plan. It makes zero sense to throw away the life buoy because it's not what I wanted. I wanted a helicopter. Thank you very much. If God supplied a life buoy and not giving you any other explanation at this point, you just don't have a choice. Well, I guess you could. Well, no, even if you just quit on Christianity, you just threw away your life buoy. So you don't have a choice. That's just life, how life is, what you've been given. But the other way that is, less black and white, and maybe a little more hopeful, is recognizing that we need faith. No, not even faith. We need trust and perspective. I don't know what God is doing. He is God. He's under no obligation to explain himself. Otherwise, he wouldn't be God. But I've got thousands, over 1,000 years of history in Scripture where I can see him working things out. And so somehow Romans 8:28 is true. God is working this together for good. And we want it to work together for good in 20 minutes or 20 days or maybe 20 weeks. In my case, I'm going on over 2 decades and I still don't have an explanation. For some of us, we'll live our whole lives and never have an explanation. And that fits the pattern. God operates on hundreds of years and thousands of years. God could be doing something, take my own personal circumstance, that has nothing to do with me. It might have to do with a great grandchild. And how looking back on great grandpa and grandma Potter, there's going to be something that's going to mean something to my great grandchild. And I'm going to be like shouting with joy from the rooftops one day when I realize, oh, that's how it played out.
Wow.
Or, even the monsters, for example, has sold in India. I don't know anybody in India. Maybe it's somebody I'll meet in heaven one day. And I don't know if it works this way, but they'll come up to me and said, hey, your daughter, your life, one line in the book is what made it for me, and I won't even remember writing the line. But like I have no idea what God might be doing. I am aware of people who have become Christians through this. They were given Monsters in its original self-published form, and it led them to realizing the Bible's understandable and eventually becoming Christians. But the point is, we need to have perspective. We're worshiping a God that operates on 1,000+ year plans, and we're only on chapter 3 of a story. Nobody watches a movie 12 minutes in saying, I have no idea what's going on. Everything's going disaster. I quit the movie. We don't know where we are in our personal movie yet and how long that story extends past our funeral. So relax, let God be God, grab onto the life buoy, learn to cry, get some decent friends around you, and endure, because we're not the author. And we'd all like to be written into romances with happy endings, but sometimes he writes other things, and it's his book.
There's so many things that you kind of just said that really kind of settled me, but also gave me perspective as I help other people have perspective. All, of course, hopefully through the Holy Spirit. I mean, that's ultimately, I think, the real relationship. And we are given an advocate, a counselor, one who in Romans 8, as you had mentioned, intercedes where we don't have words. He is a translator. And so I think in these moments where we don't have answers, that those are sacred moments of growing in our partnership with the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. Which
ironically, I'm realizing we don't even talk enough about. But regardless, I want to go back to something. I love this idea of a life preserver, that he himself is our portion. I think of the Levites. They didn't get a land grant like the rest of Israel. And part of the deal is that the Lord was their portion. And so here we're priests, and he has become our journey. He has become our prize. And I think there's a couple things in this sort of journey language that I'm realizing, even in my own walk, is that two things. God wants to reveal himself. He does. And he reveals himself in all these different things. The thing that I'm realizing about the Lord, though, is that he wants to be pursued. He wants to reveal himself, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. He also wants to be pursued. And so everything that you're telling me, and then the Job as a character, and this, I love the generational piece. I'll get to that in a moment. But
sure,
is that this is a journey, and it's, relationship is a contact sport. So what I hear you saying in some ways is this is about him. This is about pursuing him revealing himself to us. Maybe it's almost like we may not get the answers that we want, but we may get the relationship with God.
Yeah, you got it.
So I'm like, whoa, okay, so maybe I need to change some things in my perspective. And then the other piece that you talked about that I was like, was a haymaker, bro, was the generational piece. Here you are, and we don't know how many years. I mean, some people, they don't even necessarily think that Job is a real person. I'm sure you could go on for hours about that. But, and even if it was just a tale, whatever, that book, that character, that story, that narrative is something we're talking about on a monitor, on a computer to monitor over the internet. How many years later?
Yeah.
I mean, it's mind blowing to me. Like, to your point, we don't know if we're going to be a Job to someone else in their story in years to come. And are we willing to be that? And that, maybe that's what it means to be an image bearer, is that we sign up to be a part of how God tells a story. And so, wow, but I didn't know that I was going to be a part of this or that chapter. Whoa, I didn't sign up for that chapter. Well, you're an image bearer. And so but God is a generational God. And I'm like, oh, that lands. That lands, I think, in so many different ways. But anyway, please, any other thoughts you have with that? I love what you're saying.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that really stands out to me is, I use the example of Jeremiah. there's people in the Bible who lived pretty good lives and died of old age with their socks on in bed. And then there's Jeremiah. But who would you want to be in heaven?
Hmm.
Would you want to be Jeremiah, or would you want to be the guy who like skated through life pretty cool uh, and died of old age in bed with his socks on? Uh, like, like it talks about, I don't know exactly what the Bible is saying. I think it leaves it a little bit vague when it talks about storing up for yourselves treasures in heaven, but it does say storing up. I'd a lot rather be Jeremiah than, the theoretical character I described there. However, I'd rather live my life in the peaceful way. But the good news is we don't choose. It's not like God says, "Hey, would you like to have a hard life, or would you like to get by easy?" We don't get a choice. He's the author.
I think one of the hardest things though, Darryl, and I wanna really kind of get on a level that some people are at listening to this right now, is
Okay.
sometimes the hardest thing is to somehow be at peace with the pieces.
Oh, yeah. I like the way you said that.
Yeah, sometimes all we get are pieces.
Yeah.
It doesn't really add up. Maybe we get our head around it, but we never get our heart around it. And I think that the challenge at that point is to somehow make peace with the pieces.
I'm actually, I might be jumping ahead here in our conversation,
Yeah,
but I'm
yeah.
actually in the fall. Follow up to Monsters is going to the editor because it speaks to exactly that. Because Monsters deals with the trauma and the perspective and the quality of friends and who God is and all of this and stuff. But when I was done, I was like, but I still need to know how to live daily. So I've got my
Mm-hmm.
mind now in a place where I can accept, and I love God and I'm closer to God and I'm building that relationship you talk about. But I need to know now how to get on with my life day to day. Oh, did we lose each other?
Oh, I'm
I
there.
think we. Oh, okay.
I'm here.
Sorry, my computer did a weird thing. I need to know how to get on with my life day to day, and so I'm writing a follow up to Monsters. Same idea, memoir intermixed with biblical commentary, same level of depth. I've been at it for not quite a decade, but the close to it, and it's on Ecclesiastes. So it's called Something More, Ecclesiastes on Living Well in a Broken World, because Solomon very explicitly works on the principle that I'm only interested in what happens under the sun. He's not talking about
Mm.
eternity. He's not forecasting Jesus. He's just like here and now. What's going on? And that word meaningless that's in our many of our translations, that meaningless, meaningless, everything's meaningless, is not the word that's in Hebrew. The word is breath, breath, breath. Everything is breath. It's poetry. And what most translators have done, going back to the King James Version, is they have twisted that breath and translate it to mean meaningless. But think about it, breath is not meaningless. It's incredibly meaningful. You'll die without it. Uh, uh, Breath is essential. What it is it's fragile, it's temporary, it's mysterious, it's ephemeral, it's hard to pin down. It's hard to, you can't bottle it. It's it's enigmatic. So breath, breath, everything is utter breath is what Ecclesiastes says over and over again. And so it talks about how to live in the face of this. Anyways, sorry, I'm forecasting a book that's not even in print yet. But that's, I think, key to the second step of learning how to live is, first of all, we got to get ourselves sorted between us and God and our social network and our understanding of God's time scales and all of that. Job does that really well, but then we need other parts of the Bible to help us in our toolkit of how to live in a broken world.
Well, what I love that you just did is kind of the exegesis, or what we call hermeneutic. Hermeneutic is the science of interpretation. This is what I'm talking about. A lot of times when we think about biblical interpretation, we're like, oh, what does it really matter? This is why.
Mm.
Because the difference between meaningless and breath, and when I hear breath, I hear vapor.
Yeah,
You
that's
can't
another
even,
translation, actually. Yeah.
yeah. And so it's this idea of you can't, you good luck trying to put it in a bottle.
Hmm.
Because its escapability is there. And so this is a great example because there are certain, you mentioned fundamentalist groups. What they'll do is they'll then say that everything is meaningless except for this or that. And then if I put something as meaningless, then I may do some damage to someone's faith,
Yeah.
because at a time where they are suffering and they are hurting, I may come across as incredibly invalidating.
Hmm.
And that's actually not Solomon's point.
Exactly.
Meaningless, insignificant. And so that's how we become one of Job's friends, real quick. I
Yeah.
mean, that's just to
Really
me.
fast.
Yeah, that's to me, that's downriver real quick. So real quickly, if you're watching
Hmm.
on YouTube, I want to ask you to hit the subscribe button. I actually always forget to do this during interviews. Hit the like button. It will help promote it in the algorithm. If you're on podcasts, I want to thank you for your support. I have seen so much growth happen on the podcast platform. I also want to make a statement that if you are looking forward to getting bonus conversation, bonus clips, I put that on Patreon. I've got all kinds of stuff I put on Patreon. If you're not a subscriber on Patreon, come check it out. Maybe check it out for a month or something, see if it fits you. But I've got a lot of good feedback on the stuff I've been putting on Patreon. Okay, so real quickly, what announcements, actually you just went through one of them, which I'm really excited about,
Hmm.
announcement, books, etc., you want to share with people and just kind of give people an understanding of what you've already done?
Yeah, for sure. So www.darrylpotter.com. You'll get my website that's got my writing background. So I love the nonfiction stuff, the Job book and Ecclesiastes to come. Also, historical fiction series, which is focused on the period before Jesus. So I've got a trilogy out there now. The most recent was Bitter for Sweet, which is the story of Herod the Great's mother. Same level of academic depth, but accessibility and just a ripping good story. She's a fascinating woman in history,
Hmm.
and she's essentially responsible for the the Israel that Jesus showed up into. Not just because she was Herod the Great's mom, but because she architected how Rome wound up in charge. It's really quite an interesting story, and it has to do with her background. She was an Arabic woman, Nabatean. So amazing story. So that's fun. And then actually moving on to some other fiction works outside of the historical fiction that one just went to the editor this week. So something quite interesting there that is coming down the pipe, but I'll keep that one sealed for now.
Wow, you've got some stuff coming out that I'm actually really excited about getting some of your other stuff. And I'm also very excited about going through this. Let me tell you, one of the things I'm excited about is you have kind of given me an outline in this interview of things that I want to sort of add the understanding of psychological trauma and so forth. And I want to
Mm.
marry that. That's what I do, truth trauma theology. I intersect the aspect of psychological trauma and healthy theology to where something can be theologically therapeutic.
Hmm.
I'm going to take some of the sort of taglines that we've done today, and I look forward to doing potentially some blogs, some mini clips on it because it was just so good. You know, it's interesting coming in this interview. I was like, oh, you know, as a trauma person and all that, I work with heavy stuff all the time. Like, okay, this could be a really heavy interview. I just got to say, today you have given me a lift. I feel an
Awesome.
energy. I feel like the Spirit has answered some prayers, even of this just this morning. And I just want to say thank you. And I'm going to tell you what I tell all my guests, that we are with you and God is for you, my brother. Thank you.
Love you, Kyle, and thank you so much for having me on. It's been a really very enjoyable conversation.
Absolutely. Love you too, brother. Well, if you've been listening through this entire conversation, I want to thank you for your time. I respect it. You could spend your time watching all kinds of different things, but I'm just grateful that you were led here, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.